Let's look at the codification approach to ethics. Now, what do I mean by the codification approach to ethics? How does that play out in organizations? By codification approach, I mean using some type of moral code or moral law to determine what somebody should or shouldn't do. So the definition here is using a precise set of rules or laws that defines what is acceptable, that which is ethical, and that which is unacceptable, unethical. Now, in philosophy, this is also called deontological ethics, but I think that's just a horrible word. So that's why I'm calling it the codification approach, is that there's this idea that there's this moral code that people need to follow. So what are some examples of moral codes? Well, the classic example is the Old Testament law, the Ten Commandments, or all of the Pentateuch. The idea that there's a bunch of rules that we need to follow. Other examples of moral codes are national and state law. These rules that we follow. If we don't follow the rules, we do something illegal and we can be punished for it. Another example of moral codes that's far more common in organizations are employee handbooks that define what an employee can and cannot do and what the consequences are for not following the rules. Now, in organizational psychology, an especially important set of ethical rules are the ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct, last revised in 2002 by the American Psychological Association. And that's what one of the textbooks for this course is about, the ethical practice of psychology and organizations by Rodney Lohman. It has the code of ethics in the back of the book there, but then it's also got like 60 or 70 case studies of examples of what can happen in an organization and how it is a violation or not a violation of the ethical code, the code of conduct and the ethical principles. So that's a real important set of ethical issues if one is a practicing psychologist. In the state of California example, for example, that means you have to be a licensed clinical psychologist, or if one is simply a member of the American Psychological Association or the Society of Industrial or Organizational Psychologists, PSYOP. This is the code of ethics that we need to follow, and that's why we're making a big emphasis on it in the course. Now, what are some of the advantages of moral codes? Well, first of all, they provide relatively clear and precise guidelines concerning what some group considers ethical or unethical. They provide a standard to judge whether someone is guilty or not, in case there's some type of perceived infraction of an ethical guideline. And what that means is, has a behavior broken a rule, and should the person be punished? That's true of all ethical laws, that breaking it triggers some sort of a discipline. And in organizations, that can even go to the point of asking the question, has a person acted unethically, and should he or she be banned from an organization, kicked out, fired? And moral codes provide guidelines of what is unacceptable behavior from a fairly objective point of view. But there's also disadvantages of moral codes. It encourages workarounds and exploiting loopholes, trying to follow the letter of the law without really following the reason that the law was created. And that's a common theme in the Bible, that we really don't become as ethical or righteous as we would like to by trying to follow rules. It does show us where we're guilty, but it doesn't really help us in a positive sense of doing what we should. But when we do discover these workarounds, or just focus on a small, narrow set of ethical principles, we can convince ourselves that we're being ethical, that we're being just, that we're being good, even when we're not being as good as we could be, or are working around what's truly moral. A second disadvantage is that it encourages Phariseeism or legalism. The Pharisees were a group of religious leaders during Jesus' time who were really into following religious rules, and everybody had to follow these religious rules. And the more you followed these religious rules, the better a person you were. And they were the ones. Jesus didn't speak publicly negatively of very many people, but he sure did of these religious leaders. Because our goal often becomes, rather than becoming good, our goal becomes to appear good to others by following the rules. And then another disadvantage of the moral codes is that they may ignore the context which one actually finds oneself in, which might be quite different than the context of the person who conceived of the moral rule, and the consequences that might follow from being in a different context. So these are some of the disadvantages of moral codes. In organizational life, we have to have them because they're a matter of organizing discipline and making sure that people cooperate on at least a minimal level. But there's an awful lot of ways that these moral codes can go wrong and not provide the moral guidance that they're intended to create.